You are listening to Women's Running Stories, where exceptional women runners share inspirational stories about their running experiences.
So when I was injured and healing from this really traumatic wilderness accident, both physically healing and emotionally healing, kind of piecing myself back together, I couldn't bear weight. I couldn't walk, right? So I was doing a lot more sitting, so that there's a lot more time for writing. And but it wasn't just that I had time to write; it was that I needed to write because I was going through so much inner turmoil, both kind of facing what it might mean to never run again. Because before my surgery, my surgeon told me pretty dismissively that if he were me, he would never run again, based on this injury, this broken leg I had. Hi, my name is Katie Arnold, and I am a writer and a mother and an athlete, and I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico.
Yes, this episode features the story of elite-level ultra trail runner and writer Katie Arnold, with a focus on how healing after a traumatic injury helped Katie rediscover a pure joy of running and a magical return to racing. And this happened over the period of time when Katie was 46 to 48 years old. But before we hear more from Katie, I do want to welcome you to Women's Running Stories. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I am the host and producer of this podcast. Thank you for being here. If I do sound a little bit raspy, it is because I just returned from the Boston Marathon, where I talked and cheered for days. It was an outstanding long weekend. I went to great events. I heard wisdom. I met people. I reunited with people I don't see very often. And several of the people I met will be future guests on the podcast, so you have that to look forward to. The lineup on the schedule right now, it is amazing. In addition, I got to co-host my third annual Boston Marathon live event. I once again joined my good friends Julie and Lisa of the Run Farther and Faster podcast. And this year, we were in conversation with Bree Bamer, Kelly Bruno, and Elisa Harvey. And I want to thank everyone who showed up. We had a packed house in the expo. There was literally standing room only. Thank you so much for being there. And if you were not able to attend, it was recorded and the whole conversation will be on the podcast coming soon. So you can stay tuned for that. Something else to know about the podcast is that I'm changing the day of the week that the podcast is published. It is now going to be on Tuesdays. I have been putting out episodes on Fridays. That is changing to Tuesdays. So there will be no new episode next Friday. You can look for the next new episode on Tuesday, April 30th. All right, so let's get on to Katie's story. Katie Arnold is indeed an elite-level ultra trail runner and a writer. She has also had 2 children, and she is a wife. And this episode is coming out on the occasion of the publication of her second book, titled Brief Flashings in the Phenomenal World. It just released on Tuesday of this week, April 16th. And to borrow the description that her publisher put out, this book is a Zen study wrapped in a memoir that tells the story of a search for stillness by a woman born for wildness. And it's an apt description. This book is phenomenal, and this episode does indeed focus on the same period of time that is covered in the book. Of course, her book goes into much more detail than she gets into in this episode. But in either case, the story covers the same period of time, roughly the 2 years between 2016 and 2018, beginning with Katie experiencing a traumatic rafting accident through her process of healing and her return to running. And weaved throughout Katie's experience is her practice of Zen meditation and what she learns through the Zen teachings and how that manifests through this whole process. And I want to read a very short excerpt from the book to give you a sense of, well, what this story is all about. Katie writes, "This is not a story about skydiving or capoeira. Of course, you know that by now. It's not even really about running or Zen, nor marriage, nor motherhood. And it's a book about all of those things. I can't give you the 6 simple steps to enlightenment or the top 10 tips for running faster, but I gladly offer you my secrets and these brief flashings in the phenomenal world that crack open the sky and make us blink with wonder. The answers, if there are any, are yours to discover." That passage literally gives me chills. I really loved this book. It is a wonderful story. It is filled with wisdom. Clearly, Katie is a terrific writer. This is her second book, her first book, Running Home, about her processing grief through running. It was centered around the passing of her father, and it was released in 2019. So this episode covers much of the same ground that Katie covers in her new book, Brief Flashings in the Phenomenal World. And the telling of the story here really focuses on the power of belief, participating in your own healing, and the interesting dynamic of achieving goals while not clinging to them. Or put another way, staying with where you're at instead of focusing on the finish line. A couple of details to know before we get going here. First up, I do want to thank Sarah Lavender Smith for putting Katie in touch with me. Sarah has also been on the podcast. I will link to her episode and I will link to Sarah's writing. She is a book author and she has a newsletter. I also want to emphasize that before Katie's accident, she was a top ultra trail runner in the United States, but she had never run 100 miles. Also, Katie mentions the Leadville 100-mile trail race, and just so there's no confusion, she also mentions the Leadville 100-mile mountain bike race. They both exist. They're 2 separate events. For the running race, Leadville is very popular in the ultra running community, and it is regarded as one of the toughest 100-mile races. It's at very high altitude, and the course is very difficult. And it is so popular that there is a lottery to get into the race. Runners can enter the lottery in December, and names are pulled in January. This comes up as well. So there's about a month in between when you put your name in for the race and when you find out if you have actually gotten into the race. Katie also mentions fellow racer Addie. She's referring to Addie Bracey, who is also one of the top trail runners in the United States. And she mentions the mountain near her home in Santa Fe, and she is talking about Atalaya Mountain. All right, we are ready. And Katie tells this whole story in her own voice. You will not hear from me again until after the story is over. Now here to tell her story is Katie Arnold.
I had been running ultra marathons since just after my dad died in 2010. And the more I ran and the more success I had, because I did have success kind of right out of the gate, the harder it was to sort of remain in this state of, I kind of had this pure relationship with running prior to being a competitive runner, where the running was really like where I went to write stories. And I would run up a mountain and kind of have all these ideas come to me. Or if I was working on a piece, like a journalism piece, and I went running after work, like I would work through, sections that had felt thorny or complicated. And going way back as a child, when I first knew I wanted to be a writer, when I was like 6 or 7, I also had a physical practice, which was like I rode around the block on my bicycle. I wasn't a runner quite then, but I just was always in motion. And I just discovered by accident that, when I was in motion, I was making up stories, that I moved my body and then I moved my imagination. And so that stayed intact all through my teenage years, my 20s. And I just always describe running for so long as a very personal endeavor, a personal practice. It never mattered. Performance was never the issue, right? Like how I did, how I fared, if I won races, what people thought of me. But that all changed in my 40s. In my early 40s, after my dad died, and I was so in the depths of grief, which was manifesting as anxiety, that I turned to ultra running. And honestly, like, again, that was not a premeditated thought, like, now I'm going to heal myself with running, but it was just the only thing that worked. And so I started racing and finding success really early. And the more success you have, the more your ego becomes identified with that success. And I just found it to be even a finer line, to stay on the sort of creative, personal side of running versus the outward sort of performative side of running. And I just had this instinct that if I wanted to preserve running as this deep personal practice and way of being in the world and way of being a writer, that I would have to be really careful with the competition. And so in the years right before my accident, I had won some bigger races, and I could feel myself slipping into over-identifying with being this elite runner and over-identifying with the results versus the process. So that's what I also knew. It was kind of like a wake-up call, the injury. And I knew if I were ever going to run again, I would never run the same as I had. And just as I would never be the same as I had. And I realized that this was a good thing. So my husband and I, his name is Steve, we have always, since we met, and we met in the year 2000, so we've been together many, many years. We've always gone on wilderness trips, hiking, backcountry skiing, backpacking, but probably our favorite way was to travel on rivers. And but we'd always wanted to do a couple big trips. And one of them was the Middle Fork of the Salmon, which is renowned as like probably second only to the Colorado through the Grand Canyon in terms of just beautiful, remote wilderness whitewater. And our friends in the year 2016 happened to pull a permit. So this is for a private trip. So no guides, like we bring our own boats, we row our boats and whatnot. And we got to the river, and it's unlike any river we have paddled, like really fast, really busy, tons of rapids, fast moving water, just kind of a frenzy. And we were with a big group, and the boat launch is always a busy, stressful place. You're trying to like rig your boat and get off the beach so that other people can launch. And anyway, we launched, and in a fluke accident, within 10 or 15 minutes, our group had spread out. We had a lot of Idaho old timers, like 70-year-old river rats who'd run the river like a dozen times between them. And we were going to follow their line, just to get the feel for the water, like really just to get in the flow, literally. And, they went out in front and we didn't see them. And we came upon this rock, and instead of the current sort of spinning us off the rock, it pushed us up onto it. And so our raft is folded up on this rock. We're kind of like vertical to the water. And every muscle in my body is resisting falling in the water. Like I am tensed, completely. And my husband goes in first, right? Like, and he sort of gives in to the fall, and the water's shallow, like probably no more than, 3 feet deep. And I brace for what seems like forever. And then finally the raft is tipping over me, and I go in, and I don't know what happened, but as soon as I go in, I know I'm really badly hurt. And I don't remember like if I hit myself on the bottom, or if it was the torque, like if it was the bracing against the fall. But anyway, I'm in the water. I sort of, my knee is like a jostly little thing, and it's joint. Like it feels totally wrong. I get to shore. We kind of collect ourselves, and we have to make a decision. Are we going on? Like, will we stay on the river, or are we going to try to bash our way off? And 2 miles downstream on a river is not like 2 miles, on a trail. There is no trail. The banks are super overgrown. We have a boat with all our gear, and we're in shock. What happened in the immediate aftermath is like when there's a trauma, your mind automatically tries to make a narrative around it or a story. And once you can sort of form a story, then you can believe the story and then you can get through the thing. And so the story that I came up with, even though evidence pointed to the contrary, was that I had dislocated my knee. And a friend of mine on the trip right away came up and was like, oh, this just happened to a friend. She dislocated her knee. It was really, really painful, but it wasn't serious. And I just went with that, right? Like, I'm in shock. Let's just go with that theory. Well, pretty soon it was like evident I couldn't bear weight. My leg swelled up like a balloon. It was incredibly painful, but I was still trying to stay with that story because it meant I could stay on the river, and I didn't want to leave the river alone because I couldn't even walk. And anyway, I decided to stay on the river the whole time. So it was 6 days on class 4 whitewater. It's a 100-mile section of river with 100 major rapids in 100 miles. So it is nonstop whitewater. And I was like, well, one thing we knew for sure is that I could not fall out of the boat again. So I actually got put into an older boatman's sort of bigger, sturdier raft. And he rowed me all the way downstream. And Steve was behind us in our little boat. And yeah, that's kind of the story of, and that in itself, that journey was like a Zen experience in staying on the river and staying with something incredibly difficult. And having to be so focused on, there's 100 rapids. I could not think about even the next rapid. I could only focus on the rapid we were in and staying in the boat. So that kind of intense presence really began for me on the river. I got home and I called my doctor, my family doctor right away, who I love. And he was like, you need an x-ray. No, I called him and I was like, I need an MRI. And he's like, you need to go in first for an x-ray. And I was like, what? And so I don't really remember going in, but obviously I did. And he called me the next day and he was like, Katie, you shattered your tibial plateau, which is this bone right below your knee where your tibia attaches. And he's like, you're going to need surgery and it's going to be a really hard recovery. And I was so shocked because, I really had believed my story. Even if there was a moment on the river, which there was one moment when I tried to get up and I literally just grazed my toe on the ground, and that little bit of weight sent excruciating pain through my legs. So, but then, I think in order to stay on the river, I had to push that thought away that I couldn't think that it might be broken. So I was pretty floored. I really genuinely was surprised and horrified, to be honest. And, he was like, it's going to be 14 weeks. And the accident literally had happened, I think, on the first day of summer. And I was like, that's the whole summer, And so, and I didn't have any time to spare because it had been broken for a week, right? And so I had burned up all the time I might otherwise have to sort of research surgeons or figure out my plan. I had to get surgery basically the next day, and a trauma surgeon did it. And as I mentioned earlier, he was the one who was like, I've never run again. And I was like, how can this person cut me open and put that energy into my body? I had sort of already had this understanding about healing, which was that I was going to have to heal my mind in order to heal my body. And I was going to have to train my mind to heal my body. And this just came to me over the course of a few things in the immediate aftermath of this accident. I went to see the surgeon, as I mentioned, and he was very dismissive and kind of, doctors carry a lot of authority. And so when you're already in a traumatic place, injured and in shock about the news of your injury, because I didn't realize that I had shattered my leg. And, here he is delivering this news. You can give them a lot of authority without meaning to. And I didn't have my voice that day in the office with him. And I kind of just let him tell me his story, which was running is a terrible thing for your body and you should never run again. And if you keep running, you're going to, basically have terrible arthritis and it's just a bad idea. And he actually said to me, find a new hobby. And, running was not a hobby for me then. It's always been a lifelong practice. It's been central to my creative process as a professional writer and a journalist and an author. I was at the time writing my first book, which was a memoir about losing my father and teaching myself to run ultra distances kind of as a way to heal my heart. So, but I just let him tell me that, I was in his office. I couldn't find the words that I needed to advocate for myself or let him know that, running was not a hobby, but it was like a way of being for me and a profession. And I went home that night and I was just gutted for all the reasons you'd expect, to be told, like, you should probably never do the thing you love, one of the things you most love in the world again. And I went to sleep, and in the morning, and I woke up and I was filled with this clarity of what I needed to do. And it was my intuition, my instincts, whatever you want to call it, kind of rising through me, my truth. And I knew that I needed to call the surgeon and just explain to him, not who I am, like, you should know who I am, but, who I am on the inside and why this matters to me. And I don't know how I got him on the phone, right? What surgeon ever picks up his phone or her phone? And somehow I did. And I actually called the tech, his surgical tech, and he called me back within 5 minutes. I was so shocked that I hadn't really planned on what I was going to say, but I just started speaking, and it came from like my deepest truth inside. It was like coming straight up from my belly. I don't know how else to describe it. And I explained that, I'm a runner and I run, and I'm writing a book about running, and it's also how I write. And he listened, I give him so much credit. He really heard me. And he said afterwards, none of this will change the fact that I'm going to do the best job possible in lining up your bones again. Like, my surgery will be the same, but I heard you. And when I hung up the phone, I felt, okay, now I can go into surgery. Because prior to that, I was like, I don't think that this person with this attitude can actually heal me. Like, even if he is, putting a plate in my knee and screws and like healing, doing the physical work of healing me, if I don't speak up for myself, this energy is going to be in my body of non-healing. And so after that moment with the surgeon, I went into surgery. I felt clearer about it. And that kind of guided me through my recovery, which, I would encounter other people who were purporting to like heal me, like a physical therapist who on our first session, spent 10 minutes talking about how bad running is for your body. While I'm on the table, maybe like 10 days out of surgery. And he meant, I don't know what he meant, but he was a little bit younger than me. He was a competitive athlete, a cyclist. And I just all of a sudden put up my hand. I don't know if I sat up on the table, like I picture myself just sitting like bolt up on the table. But I said, you can't heal me if you believe that. Like, don't you understand that as you're and he was actually working on me at the time. Like, we were doing these like tiny little stretches while he's telling me how bad running is. And I just told him that that's not going to work for me. Like, if you can't heal me, if you're also putting that sort of energy into my body, literally as you're touching me. And he was surprised, like he hadn't ever put the two together. And it was so clear to me in that moment. And so that became this process or this understanding for me that I had to fully believe in my own healing, and people that were healing me also had to believe in it for me to heal fully and completely and in a timely way. And so that's really when I started to just claim my own healing. It was really powerful. And it was not something that started in my brain. Like, I wasn't trying to troubleshoot. It just was all intuition and instinct. So then, like, for example, people would, they'd heard I'd been in this crazy river accident. I mean, the story of the accident is quite dramatic. But people would want to talk about the accident because it's sort of an exciting story. And, but I would try to spend as little time as possible talking about how I was injured and shift the conversation to how I was healing. Because I thought if I put myself in the mindset of healing, that I would heal faster and more completely. And so then when I would write in my notebook, I wouldn't write like, I will heal completely and fully and in a timely way. I wrote it in the present tense, like I am healing completely. And actually, even at first, I started writing my body as healing. And then I was like, no, I'm going to take even more ownership over this. I am healing my body. And so it was just, as a writer, like language matters to me. But this wasn't something I was like someone told me, or I didn't read a book on like manifestation or positivity. It was just, it felt intuitive to me that like, if I didn't believe it completely, and that doesn't mean I didn't have tons of doubts and fears. And I also wrote those down in my notebook. So it was like I was allowing for both, because you can't really turn off. You're going to have fears. You're going to have the surgeon's voice like screaming at you in your knee. At least I did. Like I couldn't deny that I was afraid. But at the same time, I also had to write as though I was healing myself, and I am healing myself. So I have a writing practice, which is not dissimilar to my running practice, in that I try to write most days. And when I write, I write for my job. So I'm a journalist and a book author, but I also write for myself in notebooks. And so oftentimes most days I try to sit down and write, 5 or 10 minutes in my notebook, whether it's a dream I had in the night or something that happened recently or an idea I do have for a story, something like that. The notebook is where it goes. And I give myself permission to write whatever I want in the notebook. It does not ever have to be for something or mean anything. What I did, I think, especially during that recovery, was that I just put my timer on for 10 minutes and I do what is called writing practice, and what my dear friend Natalie Goldberg, who has written many books on this and kind of invented writing practice, is that you just keep your hand moving for 10 minutes and you don't edit yourself and you don't cross out. And the other rule is you're just free to write terrible shit if you want. And so I was doing writing practice as I'd learned many years earlier from Natalie, and I just found myself writing about, you could start writing about like apples and end up writing about running up a mountain, right? There's no rules to writing practice. Like it can take you where it takes you. And it's really a way of seeing your mind. And so I don't know what my topic was that day, but pretty quickly I found myself imagining myself running this 100-mile race. And I was describing the wildflowers in the meadows and the high alpine bowls. And I think I was in Colorado. I didn't really have a specific race in mind at the beginning of the writing exercise, but I saw myself very clearly like running through aid stations, drinking miso soup. Like it was very vivid what I imagined. And I kind of just was so swept up in this writing practice that when I finished, I had that euphoric feeling of having just run. And it was that same like tired, but really happy exhaustion. And writing is a physical practice. You use your whole body when you write. And so I realized in that moment, after I spent 10 or 15 minutes writing about this visualization I had, that I could run on the page even when I couldn't run up the mountain during my injury. And that was this great aha moment of that I could have that same sort of exhilaration and presence and almost wildness that I have running, just sitting on my porch writing. So I started running on New Year's Eve. So that was like about 6 months from the actual accident. But I had gotten off crutches, around the first day of fall. And I had spent the fall learning to walk again. And like, it's just weird bearing weight on, and there was a lot of like, my foot had sensation. And so retraining myself how to walk, and you just do that in a progression. Like I wasn't following a plan. It was not like a quote, return to run plan. This was just like a return to like being Katie in motion plan. And, but I I was at a writing residency in New Hampshire where I walked a lot. I rode this like ancient bicycle that, weighed like 40 pounds, and that was making me stronger. And I was just so delighting in moving under my own power that it was so wonderful that I didn't need it to be more. But that said, I got home to Santa Fe after my writing residency, and I started walking up the mountain where I run a lot, and I was sort of getting stronger again. I was still doing a ton of strength training because I had a big strength imbalance. And it was just gradual, and it was very natural. It was like I would wake up and I just knew what I would check in with myself and be like, where do I see myself today? And sometimes it was up a mountain. Sometimes it was, riding my bike. And I just listened to that. And so I had been going up the mountain a lot. And, but I was afraid, it's natural. Like I was afraid to start running because I'm like, what if when I start running, it really hurts and the doctor will have been right. And even though I'm quote unquote healed and my bone is healed and the plate has done its job, like I'm not going to be able to run again. And so I think I put it off a while, or let's say I was like extra patient and not starting because I didn't want to find that out. And I also knew that I wasn't going to just decide the day I was going to start. I wasn't going to put it on the calendar and be like, today marks 6 months, that it would have to be instinctive and it would have to come from my body, not like my will. And my will is strong and powerful. It's like what was getting me up the mountain. And it was like, that's how I got to strength training. Like you have to have a certain amount of determination, but the return to running, I knew was just going to come from my body and like my spirit. And so I was going up the mountain, I was hiking. It happened to be New Year's Eve, which is like always kind of a meaningful day for me. Cause it's like, you reflect back on the year and, it'd been a pretty wretched half of the year, the second half of the year. And like, I didn't wish it on anyone, but I also realized that it had taught me a lot. And I don't know, it was just at the top of the mountain and I always hike up one way and I kind of come down this other way. And just on the way down, I was with my dog, Pete. And without thinking, I just broke into like a little shuffle run, like a little jog. And it felt amazing. And it felt super tentative. And I'm sure I was like barely running. But to me, I felt like I was running. And, my leg held. It wasn't like springs and stuffing were popping out like you picture, like it didn't implode. And I just ran. And I was so joyous that I think I was like yelling out to my dog, who just looked back at me like, what? We do this all the time. Like he doesn't know that, like, we just run up mountains. That's what we do together. And so it was so joyous, and it was still also uncertain, like just because I ran that one day and it felt great didn't mean that it would always feel great. And I knew that, but I was so grateful for that one day that I decided to use that, like to build up on gratitude versus like fear. And so the next phase of my healing was trying to sort of like move the fear out of my body. Like it was a trauma response. Like it was still, in my body. I felt like the doctor's voice was still in my knee. And it was like I had to exorcise him, from my body to then really go back to running. So I wasn't like, now I'm back to running. Oh, remember that thing you wrote in your notebook about running 100 miles? Like sign up for a race. Like I gave myself so much time and room to come back so gradually and to not put any pressure or expectation. Because there were still days when, I remember I had this one day when I was running up the mountain and I got to this like specific spot that's kind of scrambly, and you really pretty much have to just scramble. And I remember looking down at the rock and I was like, I don't know if I'm ever going to race again, but I'm doing this and that's what matters. And it was just being able to find joy in the moment versus layering on all this extra pressure. And that's the pressure I'd been feeling before the accident of like, ultra running. People are always like, you finish one race and you've barely taken off your sweaty shoes and people are like, what's your next race? Yeah, and the next, and it's like, it's very, it feels like like a consumption some ways. And so I had been sensing that and resisting it. And so this healing was really like a respite from that and a practice in being compassionate to myself and being like, well, who cares? Maybe you won't race again, but doesn't this feel amazing to be up on the mountain today? And then the other thing was just time. Like it just took time for me to trust my body again and to be like, okay, it mostly doesn't hurt. Yeah, there's some days where it feels weird. Like I just remember in the beginning, the back of my knee felt like very like coming back to life in an uncomfortable sort of tingly way. But it was around that time that my friend Natalie gave me this book, Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which is this absolute classic Zen text from the early 70s, but I had never, and though I'd been sort of dabbling in Zen and my friendship with Natalie had kind of introduced me to Zen, I had never, ever even heard of the book. And it was teaching me like to be so present and be exactly where I am in the running versus like way ahead of myself in how I wanted it to be. And that, I think, that was so instrumental in like just allowing myself and my body to be where it was. The lottery for Leadville, it's lottery, right? It's such a popular race that you have to put your name in and they draw your name and you're selected or not. And that you have to enter the lottery in December. So this was a full year after I'd started running again. So 18 months from the accident. I had done one race. I guess I did a trail marathon in September of 2017, and it went amazing. Like I was terrified. I was so afraid. I thought I was going to have a heart attack because I was like, what am I doing in this race? And is my body up for it? And I ended up setting a course record and it was just phenomenal. And I was really kind of running from that Zen place of letting go of a need to perform or any expectations. And anyway, so I'd run that one race in September, and I don't know, I just read, I saw something one day that the Leadville lottery was opening. And again, this is kind of going back into like your intrinsic sort of motivations and knowing. And years earlier, when I was in my 20s, I was really into mountain biking. And I always had wanted to ride the Leadville 100 mountain bike race. But you're going to laugh because I sort of thought, I was like horrified at the idea of spending, 10 or 12 hours on my bicycle. It seemed way too hard. And then I got married and I had babies and I could no more maintain my bicycle and keep the tires pumped up and the shock pumped up. I had way too much going on. So I sort of let mountain biking go and I moved into much more of trail running. It was so much simpler. But when I saw that thing that day in December 2017 about Leadville, something jogged in my mind about Leadville. And hadn't I always wanted to do Leadville? And there was something about the name. And then a few years earlier, I had run the Trans Rockies, which is a 3-day race. And I had one of my best days ever running up Hope Pass, which is also a beautifully named, 12,500 foot pass that's on the Leadville course. And I had run up that at Trans Rockies and was the first, woman to the top, and it just felt incredible. And so those things combined, and then honestly remembering that visualization that I'd had, again, not in a conscious way, not look, I visualized this back in my notebook. Now I'm going to make it so. It was just kind of in my subconscious. And I think because I have been doing this practice and both meditating and writing, that I'm able to tap into that instinct. It's pretty available to me. And so those three things combined, and I was like, yeah, this feels right. And I put my name in, I entered. You had to say a little bit why Leadville. And so I think I must have said that about how I always wanted to be in Leadville as a mountain biker, but I gave it up. And then, by the way, I'd had this crazy accident, whatever. I'd never run 100 miles before, except in my notebook, which had felt really real. And put my name in. And then honestly, I kind of forgot a little bit that I'd entered. We went on a big trip to New Zealand, and But when I found out I got in, I was like, I just screamed. And that's not like me. Like a lot of times I'll sort of guard that information and figure out like, am I still into this? Do I want to do it before I go public with it? And I just like announced it to my family. And then it was like, okay, so how do I do this?
Yeah.
Really, my approach to training was kind of how I'd always approached training for ultras, which was like to just listen to my body and to have like a general plan, which was like to increase my long runs each week or, for 3 weeks and then take a rest week or whatever. But I never did workouts, or I just was trying to hit sort of benchmark distances. And again, I did that in kind of an unconventional way too, in that one long run was like a Easter pilgrimage to this little town in northern New Mexico called Chimayo. And pilgrims walk there on Good Friday. And my friend and I decided to run there. And it was 30 miles. So I was like, okay, that's my 30-mile run. But we weren't clocking it. Like I had no idea my pace. We stopped a lot. Like there were dogs that chased us. It was a journey. But that set the tone because I'm like, running is a journey, and if I make it work or feel like, as soon as I make something feel like training, capital T, like I lose that joy. And I knew I was going to have to run from this place of joy and for joy. And so that was kind of my training. And I just, I hopped in this 50-mile race last minute because I was like, okay, I'm ready. And then I did 100K. So I had those stepping stones, but my in-betweens were pretty unconventional. And like, I don't know ever kind of mileage I did each week. So that all went into it, like me knowing what kind of mindset I needed to run Leadville. And again, like the mindset is so powerful and important. Like it's as much or more powerful than your physical training. It takes so much intention and determination to show up in the moment and to be fully present to, your training run today or this mile that you're running today, while, knowing you're trying to work toward this much bigger goal, but you can't focus on the result. You have to just be here now. I even, hesitate to say it because it sounds like you're just being really passive and letting life happen to you, but it's actually the opposite. And it kind of sounds trite, but like it's a lot of work. And so every day I would go out and I was holding this idea of Leadville, like, yes. And I'm saying it out loud, which is always a good sign, like that I'm actually, that I really want to do it. And I'm talking about it, but not too much. But I'm also just focusing on, what do I have to do today? And I was able to stay in that state, and I think already like the sort of my mindset as a runner was naturally that way. Like I would always, I never knew who was racing, and I didn't want to know, who my competitors were before I got to the starting line. And so I think I've always had kind of that uneasy relationship with competition, but on race day, like I show up and I'm like ready to, just to give everything. And so I just remember leading up to Leadville, like I didn't know who else was competing. I didn't worry a lot about what kind of time I would have. It was only maybe like a week before that I was like, I better figure out my splits, my aid station splits, just so I could tell my crew like when I might come through. And so it was only then when I kind of added up and I was like, I know I'm sort of running this pace. And anyway, I realized that like, even when I padded up and rounded up, that I was like around 21 or 22 hours. And then I realized that was a fast time on that course. But then I realized it. And then I also had to let it go because I was like, I can't run from a place of chasing time. Like I'll never be able to do 100 miles. And so it was just this sort of knowing that I was going to have to tap into like the energy of the mountains as much as my own energy. Like my own energy would carry me only so far. And then I was going to have to sort of run with the mountains. And that really comes from this Zen practice that I'd been doing where I was like, my energy is finite, but the energy of the world is infinite. And so how am I going to tap in? And I practiced that a little, like I did go to a Leadville training camp, which was so important, not just because I got on the course. I mean, that was important, but because I was able to compare what it felt like one day to run, like constantly looking at my watch and worrying about my pace. And I did well, I had a good day that day, but it felt like a lot of effort. And so the next day I went into the training run. I was like, okay, I'm going to let go of time and I'm just going to let the mountains carry me. And I had just an absolute breakthrough in that I was like, this is how I have to run the race. So fast forward, I'm driving to Leadville and like, I'm so overcome by the fact that I'm even making it to the starting line healthy, and my leg, all those fears, my leg has healed. I still have no idea if I'll be able to do 100 miles, but I trust my body and I trust my leg. And sometimes I can even forget which leg it was, and that's always a sign that you have healed. And I just was so overcome with gratitude that I had to pull over on the side of the road. And I was like looking at the mountains, and I just felt this enormous thankfulness. And I also thought, like, I have no idea if I'm going to be able to do this, but that's okay. Like, anything that happens from here on out is a celebration of this path I've been on. And so that's really how I went into the race, as like a joyful expression. And even at the pre-race talk, when Ken, the race director, is like, look around, like half of you won't finish. I was like, that really easily could be me. Like 100% could be me. And I just showed up and I was like, I'm just going to run. My strategy for the day was just to stay in that flow state, which is like being with the mountains, for as long as I could. And then when I got out of the flow, I was just going to have to hold on as long as I could. I found out probably at mile 20 that I was in second. And my first reaction was like, oh no, like, no, that's too soon. Like, I don't want to know that. Like, I want to stay in myself. And no sooner had I had that thought than I was like, well, this changes nothing. Like, I'm still going to run in this flow state. And I had written on my hand my little mantra, which was smile and flow. Like, smile for the gratitude of being in these beautiful mountains, and then flow with that. And so I just kept looking at my hand, and the Sharpie marker was like getting more faint. But, by then it was like I was committed to my mantra. And people, like spectators, would be like, she's 6 minutes ahead, get her. And I would just smile and be like, I'm not changing anything. Like, I'm just running this way. And so I would get pulled out, and then I would remind myself, like, just stay in yourself. And also it really had helped that one of my pacers had run the race a bunch of times before, and a couple other people who had told me this. They're like, the race doesn't even start till mile 63, or like, don't even think about racing this thing until mile 63. So I kind of had that in mind. That was nice, just information. Like, don't even treat this as a race until, you're 2/3 of the way through. And that 63 is because there was like a big climb, and, so I just put it out of my mind. And then, my favorite part was when I got to the halfway mark. It's an out and back course. So I got to mile 50, and that's where you can have your first pacer. And my husband, Steve, was pacing me 12 miles up over Hope Pass, which had been that section that I had just, done so well and felt so amazing at Trans Rockies. And I'm with Steve, and we're having a lot of fun because we're hiking. And that was part of the plan, is like, I had told him, I was like, I want you to, give me my trekking poles, and we're going to power hike. And he's so good at that. I mean, he takes like one step for every like 5 steps I take. And I was like, you're going to, remind me to eat every 30 minutes. And then when we get to the top, we're going to like roll through it and, run down the other side. So he knew the plan, but the whole way up, we're just having fun. And there's all these racers coming toward us because they're still on the out part and I'm on the back part. And I got so much energy from everyone. Was like, yes, second woman. And by now I was just like, I was so centered in myself that I could hear that and not be pulled out. And I would just smile and like thumbs up, or I would like, I'm chatty on the trail. I would like whoop at them and be like, yeah, good job. And every time they were like, she's 2 minutes up, I would just smile and be like, that's cool, but I'm not changing anything right now. And one guy passed us, and he had an Australian accent. This was like my favorite moment of the race. he said something in his Australian accent. And my husband, Steve, who's hilarious, like didn't miss a beat. And he starts singing, the Men at Work song, We Come from the Land Down Under. And we sing that like for 2 miles up Hope Pass. So we're having fun together. And we needed that because we'd had a hard go of things in the immediate aftermath of the accident. It sort of caused this fracture in our relationship that, just like I had to heal my body and kind of my spirit, I needed to heal that rupture. And so we're having a blast, and, we get to the top and we come like 6 miles down the mountain, and it's right at mile 63 that I catch up to Addie, who was in first place. And it was just wild. Like, I didn't plan that. That was not, but it happens to be exactly where everyone said, well, now it's a race. And even then I was like, okay, so now it's quote unquote a race, but I just have to do what I have to do right now, which is I have to get up the second part of the mountain, because there's a little big steep climb out of that aid station. And my husband, Steve, drops off, as was the plan. And this guy I had just met named Joe picks me up to be my pacer. And Joe knew the plan too, which is like, take my poles when I don't need them, make me eat every 30 minutes, and let's keep moving. And so Joe and I just did the plan. And we passed Addie right out of the aid station. And I actually wanted to visit with her. I was like, now I've caught up with her. Like, I actually want to chat and see how, I don't know if I'm naive, but that's just who I am. And I was like, okay, good. Like maybe we can run a few miles together. And it was clear when I got up to her and I spoke to her that that was not where she was, and that's okay. And so Joe and I just kept going, and we just did our plan, which was, we hiked fast and I ate. And then when I was struggling, I put on some meat, or not struggling, but when I was sort of like, I needed a lift, I put on music. It's like childbirth too. When something stops working or something, becomes more effortful, it's like you have to change positions. So I would do that. I do that a lot in ultra running. Like if something feels really hard, I'll put on music. Or if I'm starting to resist something, I'll get out my trekking pole. So we just did that. And we just put more and more, I guess, time and distance on her. But I really wasn't, I was trying not to think about it. I was just trying to think about my energy moving forward on the trail. So we passed through Turquoise Lake's aid station, which is like about 13 miles from the finish. And it's really dark. At this point, I have no idea what time it is because my watch battery died hours ago. And I'm with my new pacer, Wes, who had been working, discreetly working his phone ever since he picked me up with 25 miles to go. He had been surreptitiously texting my brother-in-law in California, who was tracking us online and was giving him splits on how much time we had on Addie. And I had very explicitly told Wes, because I would hear his texts come in. And I think one time he said, we're 8 minutes up. And then I kept hearing his text and I just said, Wes, can you please turn off your alerts because it's stressing me out. And so I knew to stay in myself in that way. So he's like, of course. And so he was just secretly doing it. And we left Turquoise Lakes with 13 miles to go. And it's a technical section, or technical when you've been on your feet for that long. And so, it's rocky, it's single track along the lakes. And the moon was out and it was beautiful. And Wes, was very mindful about his information management. And so at one point he said, okay, we're, are 30 minutes up on her. And then he said, she would have to have a major reversal of fortune, and you would also in the other direction for you not to win this. And my heart went into my throat, and I was like, I'd been so focused on each moment. And of course, the finish line is I'm being drawn toward it versus chasing it. That was also a different feeling that I had, that I'm being pulled toward the end. But in that moment, I'm just I can't believe it. And but I know I also have a lot of work to do, and, at least maybe 10 miles in the dark. And that's when I sort of realized that I don't have any idea what time it is. And I was like, Wes, what time is it? And he told me that it was just before 10 o'clock at night. And I don't know how I was able to do the math, but I did the math, and I was like, if I finish before midnight, we have a chance to go under 20 hours. Again, like, that was never part of the plan. I'd never figured, in my last minute calculations, I'd never done the math to come up with sub 20. And I didn't even know if it was possible. And Wes was great. He was just very measured. And he was like, I think it's possible, but like, let's get off of this single track first. Like, let's play it safe and not trip. And so we just worked our way in silence, and Wes was silent for a long time, and we got out of the single track, and there was an aid station, and I always get so much energy from aid volunteers, and I got a real boost there. But my watch was dead, as I said. So I was just going on my motion and movement. And then at one point, Wes, it sounds sort of choked up, but he's like, no matter what happens, this is now, we're really, probably like 3 miles from the finish line. He's like, no matter what happens, you'll always be Leadville champion. And even when he said it, I didn't feel like it was too soon for him to say, because I did at that point, I was like, this is going to happen. But I sort of didn't know about the time goal. I felt like we'd slowed down, and Wes had gotten very quiet. And so I was like, oh, we're probably moving too slowly, but he doesn't want to tell me. And we could see the first lights of Leadville, and then Wes, it's been kind of lightly raining off and on. And then Wes tells me what we're going to do. And he's like, you're going to give me your pack and just run in with your headlamp, because at Leadville, your pacer can carry your stuff. And he's like, you just want to run in free without anything. And I was like, okay. And there's this long hill to get into town. And I'm just, Wes has been quiet, and I'm worried. I'm like, yeah, we're definitely, it's after midnight. And so, but then I asked Wes, I'm like, what time is it? And he's like 11:49. And I was like, what? And I think I have like a quarter mile. And, I'd been so worried. And so then I just took off and I ran, and it was like, this gorgeous, effortless feeling. And I really did feel like my body could keep going. And that's that flow state. Like, I don't know how I did it. And I really do credit like having done so much, of that Zen practice, and sort of focusing on the moment now versus the result you want. To this day, it feels that it's like some stories are beyond words, and this felt like one of them. But as we're getting right to the finish line, it had been raining and cloudy, but the clouds part, and then there is like a shooting star right above the finish line. I'm not kidding. And Wes is behind me, and he's like, or I called just Wes. I was like, Wes, did you see that? And he's like, yeah, someone is looking out for you. And, very much thought about my father in that moment. And I just ran through and broke the tape. And it was like, I had 7 minutes to spare from 20 hours. There's a Zen koan that says, what is this? And you can ask that question over and over, and the answer might change, but also it doesn't change, right? Like, the essence of something remains the same. So while my outer reality has changed, like, my inner self, like my original nature is like still me, Katie, like this curious, open-hearted, like person, embodied, like living in her body in the world. And so that is that's how I recognize myself, who I've always been, from my earliest memory of being sort of the person who puts herself out there and is curious and wants to understand things. So before the accident, I was that, and I was starting to become over-identified a little bit with results and running, and that sort of performative nature that running can take, especially in this age of social media, right? Like, I think I call it kind of a decoration. Felt decorative instead of like original inside of me. And now running continues to be an evolving thing. And I don't think of myself so much as a static, like, runner, period. Like, just that's who I am. Competitive ultra runner. Like, my relationship with running continues to change and evolve. But my essential nature as someone who will follow curiosity and try hard things and stick with things is essentially the same. And there's great comfort in that, like that the way I show up in the world might be different, but my essential nature is that person. And, lots of people are like, why did you stay on the river? And sometimes I can't figure out the answer. And then I just realize, like, no, because that's just my nature, right? That's who I am. I'm a stayer. I stay, I try. And the trying might look different. I mean, it already looks different. I'm 6 years older than I was when I ran Leadville. Like, the running looks different. Everything is different, but that sort of essential part of me as like someone who will try hard things, wants to learn new things, wants to have a beginner's mind about something she's always done. Like I'm riding the Leadville 100 mountain bike race this summer. Talk about bringing things full circle, right? And I've always ridden my bike, but I get to be a beginner this time again in terms of racing on a bike. But just even last week, someone interviewing me asked me, like, well, why do you keep doing these things, these hard things? And for a moment I had that feeling of like, God, why do I? Like, is this some weird like sickness or delusion or something? And then I was able to step back and it just be like, that's my true nature. And in Zen, there's this beautiful koan, and a koan is a question that doesn't necessarily have an answer that you solve with your mind, but you kind of sit with it and meditate with it. And the koan goes, one monk asks another, what was your face before even your parents were born? So like really asking, like, what is your essential nature, like before you were even born or your parents were born? And I think about that a lot. And that really is my true nature. And the way I sort of manifest it in the world will be different as I get older and change. But fundamentally, I'll always be that person.
That does bring us to the end of Katie Arnold's story on the podcast. Of course, you can read the complete story in Katie's new book, Brief Flashings in the Phenomenal World, which I highly recommend. It is a beautiful book, and there are so many takeaways that you can use in your own running, regardless of how fast or far you run or what terrain you run on. I am taking many of her insights into my own running, and I am focused on running short, fast events on the road and track. So our pursuits in the running world really couldn't be a whole lot more different. I want to thank Katie Arnold so much for coming on the podcast and sharing her story, and also for writing this beautiful book. Thank you, Katie, and I look forward to keeping up with Katie. And if you want to join me, please look to the show notes. I will link to how you can follow Katie on social media, and I will provide her website link, as well as a link to her new book, Brief Flashings in the Phenomenal World, and also to her previous book, Running Home. And keep your eyes open for Katie going out on book tour as well. She may be coming to a city near you, and you can meet her in person. I also want to say thank you once again to Sarah Lavender Smith for putting Katie and I in touch. Sarah, like I mentioned, was also a guest on the podcast. I will link to her episode, and I will link to her book, The Trail Runner's Companion, a step-by-step guide to trail running and racing from 5Ks to ultras. Sarah also has a newsletter called Colorado Mountain Running and Living, and I will link to that as well. Sarah is an ultra runner, and she is also a coach, and she's very involved in the trail running community. So her newsletter has a lot of great information and insight in it as well. Also, as a reminder, the next episode of Women's Running Stories will come out a week from Tuesday. I am changing the publishing schedule so that episodes come out on Tuesdays now instead of Fridays. So look for the next new episode on April 30th. I'm going to do a rerun next Friday and highlight a past episode. So if you haven't heard that one before, you can tune in then. But that will be a placeholder and a reminder for people to tune in the following week on Tuesday. So new episodes will now be coming out on Tuesdays. Also, I'm very active on social media, more and more these days on Facebook. I do have a private group for women's running stories, and there is a public page. I get there as often as I can. And because Facebook is more of a writing format than so image heavy, I do tend to share a bit more over there than I can on Instagram. But I'm also very active on Instagram. And there is a new feed just for the sub 20 over 55K project. And that is my personal quest to break 20 minutes in the 5K in my 50s. So I will provide a link to that new feed as well. I'm doing updates there specifically about this project in between the episodes that I put out about how things are progressing. So this Instagram feed is a place where this project can have its own social media home. And of course, I post regularly on the Women's Running Stories Instagram feed. So you can always find out information about the podcast there as well. So many things going on. It is a very exciting time for Women's Running Stories. I am completely rejuvenated by being able to see so many people in person last weekend. And it's gotten me very excited about doing more live events. So stay tuned for that. I am working on some things in the background here. And I will let you know when those things are going to come to fruition. Okay, well, that is going to do it for me. Thank you again so much for being here. I always appreciate you listening. I also appreciate you reviewing the podcast. I would really love it if you would take a few minutes to rate and review the podcast. This just helps other listeners learn more about why people come here and listen to these inspirational stories by exceptional women runners. So thank you. I would really appreciate. So thank you. I would really love it if you would rate and review the show. That is going to do it for me. I am Cherie Louise Turner. I'm the host and producer of Women's Running Stories. And I will be back with a new live episode April 30th. And I will be back with a new live episode Tuesday, April 30th. And until then, I do wish you joyful, healthy strides forward. Women's running. Women's running stories.
My name is Cindy Burnett, and each week I interview at least 2 traditionally published authors on my podcast, Thoughts from a Page. We talk spoiler-free about their books, so you can listen whether you have read the book or not. And then we delve into things that you most likely won't hear about anywhere else. The importance of the cover design, why they included various aspects of the story, personal details about both the books and the authors' lives, and so much more. You can find the podcast on every major platform and learn more about it on my website, thoughtsfromapage.com. Thanks so much for checking it out.